Okay. Can you guys hear me okay? Now I won't yell at you. Is that better? So when we look at the response to the business too, right, and this was talked about quite a bit in the keynote, your end consumers will go out around you, right? They'll go around IT if they can get it from Amazon directly, pay with their credit card, pay as they go. And so it's important for you to have the agility to be able to decrease this time that it takes to respond to the business. So we see with some customers, this is days and weeks from even when they have the infrastructure till it's ready to hand over to the end consumer, whether that be a developer, whether that be an end consumer in HR, finance, your end consumer on a web portal, a SaaS offering. Any of those can cause issues, right? So when you combine all this together, it's a significant amount of wait time, a lot of manual tasks, a lot of error prone, where then there's this bad reputation where, I can't get it consistently configured. So that even the gentleman from LinkedIn this morning was talking about that, right? Where this server had this step done and these 3 missed, and this other server had these 2 steps done and this one missed, right? And you're not able to actually deliver. So we want to help you guys solve that, right? We want to help actually with that entire application release process, from spinning up your infrastructure through your application, through actually updating the code and updating your app over time with DevOps types of environments. So reduce this overall amount of time and get those changes rolled out so you can respond and deliver with the right time to market to your customer base. So in order to accelerate these times and get this down from days, weeks to minutes, right, you need types of solutions, orchestration, automation that allow you to rapidly implement this and give you the flexibility to extend what you're already running and put new workloads out there as well. So, but one of the big areas that comes into contention, and one of the areas that slows these processes down a lot of times, is your change control processes, compliance, security. There's a lot of risk. I don't have visibility. How do I know? And so that can really slow you down. So we want to help give you the control to have that governance and make sure that the right workloads go through the right process as they should, and the ones that don't need it, if it's going into dev and test, just allow it to go right through. It doesn't need that full-blown approval process. So give you that control where you need it, but still give you that agility. So we look at a way to abstract and personalize that delivery. So we want to give you the ability to not only carve up your cloud resources, get your VMs out there, get the appropriate networking and security set up, get the storage, but then also get your middleware apps and databases all installed. We do this in an abstracted model way so that you can define, and I'll actually show you guys an example, and Mike will as well, a blueprint that actually is abstracted away from the details of the cloud or virtual or physical environment it's going to be deployed on. And so you can model it once and use it many times on different types of infrastructure. So you're not having, let's say 15 copies of really, an application just because of the different places it's going to get deployed. Instead, you can control those things by policy and when you map it to the environment, to the resources it's going to go against. So we have application level policies, machine level or VM level policies, and infrastructure policies. Whether these be placement rules like, hey, this PCI workload can never go into this environment because of a compliance issue, or whether it be this end consumer, this developer can never deploy any application and any workload into production. So you have that ability to do controls not only based on what's going into the environment, but also what users are allowed to run which operations. So we look at the application side, right? We want to give you the ability to accelerate this deployment in your release process, but also integrate with configuration management solutions like Salt and their orchestration. So you get that standard, consistent configurations. So you can ensure that the configurations that are important to the workload are standardized as they move between the phases of your release lifecycle. And then obviously the environments can be totally different. So dev could be OpenStack, right? And test could be Amazon, and production could be VMware. And yet you've got the same model, the same set of configurations you're able to reuse and carry across those as you pass your gates in your release process. We also have a unified self-service catalog. So this allows you to provide to your end consumer. You can actually brand this and put your own logos in there. You can brand it for each tenant if you actually have multiple tenants that you serve. You can control and specify which services show up here in the catalog. And you can build custom services out, as well as we have several you can utilize and build out of the box. We've got a marketplace, a solution exchange, where Salt and other partners in our ecosystem have delivered different services and components that you can bring into place. But you can build out your own. Like you notice in the picture here, there's HR as a service, right? So the HR team can actually have the HR apps right there, and you just click request, and obviously you can control who's entitled to request that service and where they're allowed to provision that service out to, as well as tie in an approval system. So whether it be a very simple approval system through email that it does natively, or you can plug this into your own service desk offering that you may have in your organization that needs to go through, whatever your change process may be there. So this is the extensibility that it gives you here, and that self-service need, right? We hear that from a lot of our customers, that they can orchestrate and automate these components, but they don't, they still don't have a way to just provide some sort of web portal or easy way for self-service to their end user. And so this gives you that. It gives you the traceability. It logs, what was done, where it was done, and then it's available to them. Everything's done and automated behind the scenes. So this is an example of that application blueprint that I was mentioning, and this is where you can build out multi-tier applications with dependencies across nodes and across services, and even with external services, meaning you may have existing services, a load balancer, a database server that you want to connect this application to, and you can do that. And at deployment time, it auto-binds the values and properties of those other dependencies and provides them just in time to these workloads to get them configured and set up, so you don't have to know everything statically and define it all statically ahead of time. And this is where you can utilize, and we'll show you the example of Salt and other configuration management solutions, scripts you may have to build out this multi-tier application. You notice this one has three. It has a load balancer, it's got a clustered app server, and a database server. So this will actually provision all of those nodes and run the configurations on them, load the software, run the appropriate SQL script on the database server, for example, and do all those components for you. Once you put this out in place, then you can actually reuse that model and make sure that you've stamped out exactly the same application with the appropriate dependencies from environment to environment as you need to do that. And then you can also leverage and standardize these application policies and the shared services. So this is the example where I've got an external Postgres database server, for example, that this app server is dependent on. And I can also set up policies like, in this environment, these services are blacklisted. So never deploy a blueprint that includes these services into this environment. Block it, because that's a hard requirement. These are blacklisted for a particular environment. So it gives you that control that I was talking about earlier to ensure that only the right things get put into the right environments, versus you accidentally having some sort of security breach, right, or audit risk because something got deployed incorrectly. And then you can actually go in after the fact and now update. So once you've provisioned this out, then you can go in and update the code, update the configurations as you need to. If you're utilizing Salt, it's going to manage that drift and remediate. You can also update the desired state with Salt, so as that shifts, you can make sure that's taken care of. So this really helps you reuse that and ensure that consistency, as I was talking about, through all the stages. And then update, and you can utilize the update profile. So again, you go in and you update that blueprint that's already been deployed, and now you can pick all the environments where it's been deployed and say, apply this update profile, and it'll go and update the code for you consistently across those systems. So it just gives you that ability to rapidly provision and manage these environments. A lot of the customers we talk to, they're provisioning the VM sprawl, the amount that's happening these days. There's just a lot going on. They're constantly getting demands for more systems and putting more workloads out there. But on the flip side, one of the things that the solution does also is it allows you to set up policies for reclamation. So you can sit there and go, okay, this is a dev test environment, for example, automatically reclaim in 30 days unless I get a request to extend that lease. So you can bring those workloads back, it'll delete the VMs, and now those resources are available to you to use again. So you get more utilization out of your infrastructure that you've been paying for. So why are VMware and Salt better together? So we take a look at our cloud automation suite and we take a look at Salt. We've got VMware's ecosystem that I mentioned before with our management marketplace, where there's a lot of these blueprints available and workflows, VCO workflows you can utilize within our cloud automation suite to customize and bring your processes together in an automated fashion. So you have that. You've got our policy-based governance. You have the agility, and you've got the ease of the self-service. And now you can bring in all that great salt content. So you can import your salt formulas and states. You can bring those in, build services with those, and then utilize those in the blueprint to ensure that things are being configured and stamped out the same way. And then you can control that through policies, right, as I mentioned, and publish to your self-service catalog. So that gives you kind of the end-to-end. Not only can you automate it, but then you can provide it to your end consumers in an easy way for them to consume. They don't have to know any of the details, right? They click that request button, they fill in a couple of parameters that you need, and it kicks everything off. And then after that, Salt is managing it. So when you look at not only the desired state config, the environment's drift, then Salt's going to bring them back in, right? Brought back into compliance with that desired state. So with that, I hope I didn't go too fast, but I know you guys don't want to look at slides all day, right? Let's look at a real demo. So I'll hand it over to Mike.
Great. So we're going to take a look at application directly, or application director. And the demo that we decided to build is a really basic Django demo. And oh, thank you. I don't want to get yelled at. Okay. Great. It's a really basic Django demo that consists of, 1+n application servers and a data store sitting behind it. And you could extend this, of course, in any direction you want to put load balancers in front of it, what have you. In the application director ecosphere, you have three main pillars that you need to work with. Those are services, applications, and deployments. And those correspond to containerized applications on the lowest level, containers which work together to provide a service, and then deployment, which is the deployment of that application into the cloud. So we're going to look at those sort of individually. We're going to start with a Django application server and show you how those are built in Application Director. So here's one that I've created. This is called Django Salt 1.0. You can select OSs. These correspond, of course, to container OSs that have already been provisioned with Application Director. You're probably used to this sort of thing with vSphere and what have you. And then what you have is you have a series of properties. Now, the real power of Application Director combined with the configuration management tool comes in the injection of these properties into a just-in-time deployment system, okay? And what I mean by that is when we define all of these properties, we have the ability to inject those into stages of the deployment as each one of these services gets spun up. So just to give you sort of a 10,000-foot view of how this might work, and I want to preface this by saying the way we've approached this right now is just one of many ways you could potentially do this. It's by no means the best way, and it's by no means the only way. But it's one way, and you can, of course, feel free to extend it, change it, do it however you like. It's just one approach. Again, from that 10,000-foot view, what we're doing is we're storing our salt states in an external repo. We're using GitHub in this particular demo, right? And that way, we have a clear delineation between these salt states that can live out in a repo and be under change control, and what's living in Application Director. So the first thing we do is we point things at a repo. I'll show you this in just a moment. We give it a formula name. Some of this is sort of abstracted right now, but will start to make sense as we look at how this is actually deployed. When you deploy a service in Application Director, you have a series of actions. It's really easy to think about those sort of like init scripts on a system, right? The first of those which gets run is something called install, right, which is responsible for doing the basic installation to get the container to the point where it can be configured. Now, luckily, this aligns really nicely with Salt because we have this terrific Salt Bootstrap project, right? I think it's terrific. I know how people feel about it, but I like it. And so all you need to do is a simple one-line shell script All of these in Application Director are bash, and so this should be completely self-explanatory. And that's all you need to do. At this point, Salt is installed and ready to go on the system. I should say, too, that the way we're operating inside this demo and the way we've chosen to do things has been in a masterless setup. So what we're doing is we're pulling down Salt states onto a system, and then we're simply calling Salt call against them, right? No master is involved, right? No remote communication. And it's a really powerful paradigm. So many people can overbuild systems and have masters and minions and think that that's the only way to do it, when in fact, you don't need to do any of that at all. I mean, myself in my development process day to day do nothing but use Salt call all day to point myself at states or execution modules or what have you. So bear in mind that in this example, you don't even need a master. You just use Salt call to point to these states, and it's off to the races. In the configure step, what we do is we begin by importing the variables which Application Director has provided to us. These correspond to the properties we looked at a few minutes ago. Then what we do is we go through and we just clone down the repo. Simple git clone, nothing to it, right? And after we've cloned the repo onto the container, we move that stuff into place, into Serve Salt, right? This is dead simple, completely brainless bash, right? It's super easy. The way we've aligned properties in Application Director with Salt is by connecting them in this bash script to a pillar file, right? So the step is, have these variables which come to you from Application Director, which can live as predetermined variables on a service level or on an application level, or even come to you just in time during a deployment, and we inject those into pillar, right? And then we run Salt call against that, and then Salt takes care of the rest. Does that point of demarcation make sense? Yeah, okay. And it's very straightforward. Again, we're just operating in a bash environment, so we're off to the races right here. Setting up a very basic pillar, having taken in some variables directly from Application Director. At that point, we're ready for action. We call Salt call against the state file, and we'll look at the state file in just a moment. And we're done. The box is ready to go. I promised you that we would look at that, so let's look at it. Okay. And this is one of those things that can be done in a completely arbitrary way. I chose to structure things by aligning directories here with applications in Application Director. You can modify this to suit whatever scheme you like, right? You just make that alignment inside the bash script, which ends up being the glue between what's coming down from your states and what's being provided to you from Application Director. So for example, for this Django server, this again corresponds to a file root that would get moved into place, right? At this point, hopefully, this should be completely self-explanatory to anyone who's sat through a basic Salt class, right? We're spinning up some packages, we're configuring Nginx, and we're off to the races, right? Super, super simple. In fact, there's really no pillar to speak of in this particular example because then this is all really straightforward. Not a lot of magic here. So let's get to something a little bit more interesting. Now that we have, or now that we've built up this application container, we're this services container, in order to build our application, we're also going to need a data store. One of the big problems that Application Director helps to solve is by saying, okay, given this, given that I'm spinning up servers in the cloud, right? They can be at some unknown IP address, right? And that IP address becomes known, right, at the time that it's being provisioned, right? So the question becomes, okay, if here on the other side of things, I want to spin up my application server, right? And I want to point its configuration file, right, to the data store, how do I accomplish that, right? we're going to look at how that is solved. Okay. Here we have another service, and this gets to be a little bit more interesting. Again, we have these properties which are defined. These are very simple. They're strings or arrays, right? The first two, MySQL DB name, and the formula URL. This is corresponding to this, sort of arbitrary scheme that we've come up with for storing our state files in Git. What becomes more interesting is when we look at this MySQL remote host guy. So keep this in your brain, because right now I've just specified localhost, right, in a one-element array. But when it comes to actually deploying this stuff, that's going to be populated with the IP address of the application server or application servers, right, such that the MySQL server can, when it does its state run, create users and permissions which correspond to the application server request. Does that make sense? Yes. OK. So this guy we've already looked at, right? Super simple, one line, and Salt is installed and ready to go, right? The same idea here. I spun up a couple of packages. We talked about in some other sessions about for some execution modules needing to have external libraries. So I just do that step here. That can be done in Salt if you so desire, but I just did it here for clarity's sake. And then again, we're moving this stuff into place after we clone it off our repo and using exactly the same technique to build up a pillar file with a MySQL username, a MySQL password, and MySQL DB. OK? All right. And then what we're doing is we're building up this host array here, right, that allows us to take multiple MySQL hosts being injected from application director and get those into a pillar file that Salt can understand. Okay? And then at the end of the day, we write out that pillar file, exactly the same technique, right? So this ought to be repeatable for all these services that you want to build inside application director. Super simple. So all we need to do now is begin to tie this stuff together. And the way we tie that stuff together is by building an application which utilizes these predefined services. Okay? And what we do to do that is with something called a blueprint. Okay? A blueprint is the idea that we can take these disparate services, right, i.e. MySQL servers, Apache servers, JBoss servers, right, that we've defined as we've just seen, okay, and that we can connect them together to build a service which faces the customer, right, for example, right, servers that work together to perform a service. When we look at this guy right here, this is the Django Salt application, okay? And what this does, right, the interesting thing about this, and this is what I want the take-home message of this to be, is the most interesting thing here is when you see this property name, right, the Django DB name, right, the name of the MySQL DB, right, what this is saying, okay, when this DB guy comes up, right, take the IP address, or let's see, take the DB name of this, okay, and inject it, right, into the configure script, right, for the Django application, right? This solves the problem of how do I bring up this Django application, right, and know what the name of the DB to point at is in the Django settings file, right? So that's pretty slick, right? Because you can connect these things together in Application Director, but have Application Director and Salt work together to drill this stuff all the way down into the config files where they need to be. Does that make sense? Yes. OK. So that's what ends up being pretty neat. We declare a little demo application, exactly the same idea here. And at this point, you've seen this story before. We're bringing up, during the installation step here, exactly the same technique, right? We're calling out to a GitHub repo. In this case, we're bringing down a Django app, right, that I've already written, right? But this could be your Django app. And this is one of those areas where it's sort of like you can design it however you like. How do you deploy your applications, right? This is a dead simple way to deploy an application. Obviously, your needs are going to be more complex, but this shows you the one generalized approach, right? And then in the start step, I bring up a web server, and we're done. Exactly the same idea here with MySQL, right? With properties that can be, taken in from the application server, right? i.e. to say, okay, we provisioned X number of application servers, right? Therefore, and those application servers are on IP addresses A, B, and C, right? Therefore, when I run my salt call, right, I'm going to use this pillar vial, which has the IP addresses of those servers, right, that were provisioned. And so, I'm in good shape because then my salt run automatically knows or has an understanding of the just-in-time configuration that's being provided to it by application director. Okay?
And Mike,
go ahead.
Just another thing I would add too is
yep.
one of the other features there is that some of those properties you can specify. Obviously, there's a catalog value that was in the service catalog itself, and you can overwrite it in the blueprint. But there's another option where you can say overwrite at request time. So if you want a SQL user and password to be automatically added, for example, that can be part of the request that the end user fills out, and then it's passed through to the blueprint and then into Salt appropriately.
Right.
So that's another feature that you get above and beyond always configuring this or just in time, but you can even get data from the end user and consume that all the way through.
Right. So you have all these really powerful choices, right? And you have this really simple way to get data, and glue it into Pillar, right? And then let Salt manage the configuration from that point going forward, which is super slick. At that point, all you need to do is you need to fire off a deploy. I'm not going to do one now because this is running in VMware's infrastructure and it takes like 10 or 15 minutes to actually spin up these VMs. And I'm happy to do it for people. It really does work, I promise you. It ends up spinning up this really simple application server, right, which I wrote, and connects back to a DB. But the nice thing about this is that you can spin up multiple application servers. The data stores have an understanding of the configuration of the application servers and vice versa. So you can extend this to suit your needs. As a lot of people ask about configuration remediation over time. That can be handled by installing a Salt minion, right, and using regular best practices for Salt to handle that remediation. So that's more or less the demo that we prepared. I think I'm happy, and I'm sure Becky's happy to answer questions about this or about VMware or anything you like.
Any questions you guys have?
No?
No? Actually, there's one more thing I want to show them.
Okay, of course.
Deployments and actually show them what
yes.
deployed.
Yes.
So
Yes. Thank you.
But actually, within Application Director, when you go to deploy, one of the options you get if you go to the execution plan is you can just see the kind of default execution plan that's set up for that, and it's automatically taking into account the dependencies, right, between the app server and the database server. So in this case, Application Director is actually going to run as many tasks in parallel as it can until it hits a dependency, and then it's going to wait for the dependency to be met. So you'll see here that the install of the app server is waiting on the config step of that MySQL component. And once that's successful, it's got that just-in-time deployment variable that it needs to then continue and move forward. And in this example here, we're showing you the execution plan. And this you can actually customize this. You can see the log files. So if something went wrong, you can actually troubleshoot what happened right here in the UI. And when you go to deploy, then you can then pick from multiple different cloud and physical environments that you want to provision onto. So out of the environments, Application Director support. So you may first be deploying this in dev test, like we talked about earlier, and maybe that's running on Amazon or OpenStack. And then when it's ready and tested and it's passed all the appropriate tests to move it to production and promote it, then you can actually now provision exactly the same application and the same model into your production environment on a different cloud. And then it's going to run the appropriate policies there. So let's say that somebody accidentally picked this application to run in a production environment that had a blacklisted service, and this blueprint happened to have that blacklisted service. It would actually fail the deployment, and it wouldn't move forward. If it met all the needs to go into that environment, then it would deploy successfully, and you can see the log files here. and then later come in, not only can Salt manage keeping it configured with the desired state, but with an application director, you can then update it. So if you need to get a new WAR file put out there, right, or different code files, you can do that and then push that out to the different environments.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I should point out, too, that the state files and everything that we used for this demo are all on the SaltStack GitHub repository. So feel free to go there and feel free to shoot me any questions that you have about it. And I'm happy to go over it with people individually if they have questions about how things might work for their specialized environment. Great. Are there any other questions? Travis?
Typically,
Sure.
say you have a normal vCenter setup arrangement. I've never used application director. How simple does this tie in?
To vCenter and vSphere, very simply. So when you looked at, if you go, but will you go back to the blueprint for me?
Of course.
We had logical OSs, right, that were like CentOS some version.
Right.
When you go, when you go to provision here, when you go to deploy, it'll actually find the VM templates that match that in your vCenter, and you pick the right one that you want to use that matches. So this is a logical definition so that it can cross different cloud environments, and you just map it to the template within that vCenter instance you want to use. It spins that VM up and then loads these components and installs.
And I had a follow-up question, but I asked Mike the other day. So.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific. Anything else? No?
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for coming.